Hi there, my name's Nicole Toyzan, and I'm here to give a TED Talk on a book that I've been reading called Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. So why did I choose to read this book? I was looking for a leadership book that was going to be applicable to my life today as well as in the future. And when looking at the description of this book, it talked a lot about relationship building and vulnerability. Earlier this semester, I took a skill finder test and found that relationship building is actually my strongest leadership skill. So I wanted to find out, how can I maximize on this in my current life as well as in the future? I ended up learning a ton from this book. And to be honest with you, I got more out of it than I even expected. Not just from my professional life, but also for my personal life. So I'd like to share a couple of those key learnings with you. So in this book, Brené talks about rumbling with vulnerability. And what does that mean? So we hear rumble, I think West Side Story, but it really has become a term for let's have a real conversation. Let's have a tough conversation. It's become a serious intention, a behavioral cue, or a commitment to lean into that vulnerability, to stay courteous and generous, to stick with that messy middle of that problem identification and solving, to taking a break and being willing to circle back if you need to, and to being fearless in owning our own parts, as well as listening with the same passion with which we want to be heard. That was a huge one that stood out for me. Listening with the same passion with which we want to be heard. That is huge. So this rumble cues us to show up with an open heart and an open mind so that we can serve the work as well as each other, not our egos. Brené talks about how courage is a collection of 4 skill sets that thankfully can be taught, observed, and measured. 1, rumbling with vulnerability. 2, living into our own values. 3, braving trust. And 4, learning to rise. A really powerful point that Brené touches on in this first section of the book is that our ability to be daring leaders will never be greater than our capacity for vulnerability. We have to remember that self-awareness and self-love matter. We have to practice self-compassion and patience, even though it's hard. Feeling fear is not that barrier to daring leadership. It's rather how we respond to this fear that we have. The armor, the thoughts, and the emotions and the behaviors that we use to protect ourselves when we aren't willing or we aren't able to rumble with vulnerability. But this armor, it isn't necessary and it isn't awarded. We have to learn to be vigilant about creating a culture in which people, they feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. Because daring leaders have to care for and be connected to the people that they lead. And another thing that Brené says a few times throughout this book is, if we're brave enough, often enough, we'll fall. Daring is saying, I know that I will eventually fall, but I'm still all in. Another thing she says is, I'm in the arena, And vulnerability is showing up to the arena, having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. Brené states that we have to teach people how to land before they jump. We cannot expect people to be brave and risk failure if they're not prepped for those hard landings. And how do we do this? Through 3 processes that she calls the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. First, the reckoning. Get curious. Find out what's happening. Dig in. Figure out what you're feeling and why. Then the rumble. Brené mentions something called an SFD, a shitty first draft. And basically, let it all pour out, knowing that you can reshape it later. It's unfiltered, and unfiltered is powerful. Then, after you've done that shitty first draft, cut out those confabulations and those assumptions that you're finding. Assumption making in conspiracy is a reflex of our mind's compulsive need for meaningful experience. So the stories that we tell ourselves, we have to keep those in check. They can crush our self-worth as well as the trust and connections in our teams and people we work with. The most dangerous stories that we make up are the narratives that diminish our lovability, our divinity, and our creativity. These are 3 points that Brené discusses towards the end of her book. And she mentions a reality check for each of these. The reality check around lovability Just because someone isn't willing or able to love us doesn't mean that we're unlovable. Reality check around our divinity. No person is ordained to judge our divinity or to write the story of our spiritual worthiness. And lastly, the spiritual check or the reality check around our creativity. Just because we didn't measure up to some standard of achievement doesn't mean that we don't possess gifts and talents that only we can bring to the world. And just because someone failed to see that value in what we can create or achieve doesn't change our worth or the worth of what we can do. Finding the courage to own these hard things is so important so that we can write new endings. Brene touches on this idea of the delta, basically the difference. So what's the difference between what we make up in our heads about our experiences, our assumptions, our conspiracies, and the truth that we discover through the process of rumbling with vulnerability? The delta is where the meaning and the wisdom of the whole vulnerability experience lives. The delta holds our key learnings that we just have to be willing to walk inside our stories and rumble with. So Brene breaks down 15 steps for the story rumble process, and I love this. And this is my main key takeaways from this book and how to apply it to my life today as well as in the future for leadership purposes. The first step in the process, setting the intention for the rumble and getting clear about why we're having a rumble. So this is in the case of coworkers or could be personal. Second, what does everyone in the room need to engage in this process with an open heart and an open mind? 3, what's going to get in the way of you showing up? What are the barriers? 4, make a commitment to show up in ways that support the process and avoid ways that move you away from trust building. 5, everyone must share a permission slip. This is an idea Bren brings up in her story. For example, I give myself permission to listen more today than I talk. Number 6, check in. What emotions are people experiencing throughout this process? 7, what do we need to get curious about? This helps to build more trust as well as grounded confidence by staying curious. Next, 8, what are these shitty first drafts in the room? And 9, what do our shitty first drafts tell us about our relationships, about our communication, our leadership, and our culture? About what's working, about what's not working, and reminding us to stay curious, to learn to resist needing to know everything. 10, where do we need to rumble? So what additional lines of inquiry do we need to open to better understand what's really happening here and to reality check those conspiracy theories and confabulations that we discussed? Number 11, what's the delta between all of our shitty first drafts and all of the new information that we're gathering in this meeting right now? 12, what are the key learnings? 13, what are the next steps and how do we act on these key learnings? 14, how do we integrate these learnings into the culture and leverage them as we work on new things? So what is one thing, for instance, that each of us will take responsibility for embedding into our workplace or the culture? 15, when is the circle back to regroup, check back in, and hold ourselves and one another accountable for that learning and the embedding? Each of these specific steps is a very practical way to use these skills in clinical practice in the future as a DNP student working in leadership. And lastly, Brene mentions the revolution, taking off the armor, rumbling with vulnerability, living into our own values, braving trust with open hearts, and learning to rise so that we can reclaim authorship of our own stories and lives. And she mentions 3 practical learnings from all of this research. First, the level of collective courage in an organization is the absolute best predictor of that organization's ability to be successful in terms of its culture, to develop good leaders, and to meet its mission. Second, the greatest challenge in developing brave leaders is helping them acknowledge and answer their personal call to courage. Courage can be learned if we're willing to put down that armor and pick up shared language, tools, and skills that we need for rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, and learning to rise. And last, we fail the minute that we let someone else define success for us. So, Brene mentions making a joy in meaningless to help you define what success means to you. And she ends with a quote from Joseph Campbell that states, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." Own your fear, find the cave, and write a new ending for yourself, for the people you're meant to serve and support. Big takeaways. Remember, choose courage over comfort always. Choose your whole heart over putting up that armor. Choose the great adventure of being brave and afraid at the exact same time. Have I made any changes as a result of reading this book? I would say yes. So far, they've been small changes. Things like keeping an open heart, an open mind, and remembering to stay vulnerable, and remembering it's okay to be vulnerable, and it actually makes us stronger. And lastly, has this encouraged me to read additional books? And it has. Actually, for 2021, I have made professional development a major goal of mine. And not only professional development, but personal development, and how this can help me to not only become a better leader, but a better person. Thank you.